in the Olympiad on the exam, there is, as we know, a series of multiple choice questions, but there are some open response questions as well that will require some deeper thought and connective writing and things like that. So it's not so much about a structure, but the way that you sort of attack the question, I guess. Just last time for a bit of review, this is a screenshot of Alex's presentation. The videos are up on the Olympiad's YouTube channel as well. The four things that he focused on were to be precise, to be authoritative, to be contextual, and to be insightful. I'll extend on these and hopefully provide a few more examples. I have some sample questions from Victoria, from New South Wales, and from Queensland up here as well, to hopefully flag a few techniques that I think students find successful. All right, so I do tend to call, as a teaching strategy, I do tend to call our techniques for attacking the longer form, extended or open-ended type questions. I make a differentiation between the automatics and the approach. Those words are just kind of made up, but they seem to be easy enough to remember. With the automatics, we're talking about things that you think about and do these things, at least in the planning time or the perusal time during the exam or before the exam starts. But likely in writing as well, even if the question doesn't explicitly ask you to do so. That's the important bit. That's the important bit there. So even if the question doesn't say to do it, there's a good chance that the exam marker is expecting you to do it. Just because, as you know, especially if you're in year 12, you're used to a way of thinking about economics and how to tackle these problems. We also have the approach. The approach is your strategy for answering the question. Once you've read it, once you've planned it out, once you've understood it, or at least once you understood the question, you're working out your plan. What are the order of points or arguments that you are going to make? It's a bit of the combination of your planning and your actual response. Just for a bit of clarity, extended, I'm not necessarily talking about an essay question. It could be anything just beyond a simple define this term. Anything beyond that, anything where you know that there's more than one thing you have to say or do to answer the question correctly. It could be a response that requires a few paragraphs. Question starters or stems or prompts might be explain using models and examples, or compare and contrast, describe why, outline the most likely, maybe a paragraph, maybe a couple of paragraphs. It could also be longer form, open-ended questions where the prompts for these types of questions are usually using the stimulus provided, analyze and evaluate, or given the set of circumstances, recommend the best policy or something like that, or determine the short-term and the long-term impacts of this event or this policy occurring. Or a scenario could be given to you where imagine the government did X, Y, and Z, or imagine a natural disaster hit, or imagine something happened to a trading partner or a country or another related country, in which case you might have to write a full page, a page and a half, 2 pages, depending on, the exam parameters and so forth. All right. To be a little bit more specific about what the automatics and the approach are, we tend to find, looking at a cross section of the VCE, the HSE, the QCE, and the WA papers as well. Oftentimes, the automatics are often, anytime an economic term is used, even if the question didn't ask you about it or ask you to define it, try to make some sort of short sentence fragment even of, hey, I know what this means. That if you feel compelled to mention the phrase full employment or achieve full employment, that something in your writing demonstrates that you know what full employment is. Maybe you reference NAIRU, maybe you reference cyclical unemployment, but rather than just saying this is likely to achieve full employment, there's something there. Same thing with CPI or inflation or automatic stabilizer. Define the economic term, even if the question itself didn't ask you to. Give an example, if applicable, an example of a policy or an example that's of something that could increase demand. If you have to write about something that would increase demand, give an example. If you're reading charts or stimulus, calculate a percentage change, calculate the combination of two quantities, you know, spot the tricky trend. Usually there's going to be something where it's reserved for the top mark earners, something that not everybody might see. So try to look for something that's a little bit more nuanced or something specific, a little bit more subtle in the data. And if you have to draw a diagram, you refer to that diagram in your writing. You talk about the demand curve moving from D0 to D1, or the economic cycle going from point A, the peak, down to a downswing point B, that you're actually referring to a diagram in your writing. With the approach, we've got similar to what Alex was going into last a couple of weeks ago. He said, economists on these exams, we want you to go straight to the point, open with the answer to the question. So which phase of the economic cycle did you think we were on? Based on this, your first sentence, based on the stimulus provided, it appears that from this year to this year, the economy was in a downswing. And then you spend the rest of the paper sort of justifying that. We don't need oftentimes the markers aren't interested in, there are very many reasons why managing the economy is important, like a vague general statement just to get the ball rolling, or something that's thought-provoking as if you're writing an editorial piece or something like that. If you're given, also with the approach, if you're given two policies, the positives and the negatives of the first option, and if you're given two options, you want to, which is increasing the cash rate or increasing income tax, which one of those would be the most beneficial economic policy, XYZ, that you address the positives and the negatives of both of those options. All right. Oftentimes students will think that, like, they'll read the two policies and they'll say option A is the better policy. So I'll just write about option A, and they'll take a few shots at option B just to flag that it's less optimal, but they didn't really address any of the merits or any of the positives or elaborate at all in option B, where really what you want to do is go through the full cost benefit analysis and try to identify the positives and the negatives of both of them. All right. And then obviously that last one is just, don't forget to answer the question. If the question is asking you to, which policy is the most suitable and things like that. Here's an example of what we would look at with the automatics. This is a public question from the 2015 VCE economics exam. So we have the question here. We have the diagram here. I won't read through the question. I'll allow, like, the video is recorded and will be made available, so you'll be able to practice along with this question on your own time. But say, for example, explain the movement in the global equilibrium market price. The question doesn't say to define equilibrium. The question clearly doesn't say that you need to explain what supply and demand are, but it would be a good idea to frame your writing so that way you clearly know what supply, demand, what equilibrium are. I like this question as another example of the tricky trend as well, because most of you, if you're looking at the question right now, can see that both supply increased and demand decreased. But how many of you upon first go would see that supply increased more than demand decreased? And I imagine that that's a pretty significant, the exam creators drew that on purpose. So they might want to say that the significance of the supply shift is greater than that of the demand decrease. And that's why, yes, price dropped, because either of the curves shifting in that direction would mean that the price of oil per barrel would drop. But the market still did expand because the supply side of it was a little bit greater. So that's sort of what we mean by the tricky trend, where most students would see the supply increase and demand decrease, but many might not realize that there could be extra marks to be had if you identify and apply your analysis of the significant increase in supply relative to demand. All right. So here's one also with the automatics for the HSC in 2018. Question 22, we had a increased efficiency is a rationale for microeconomic reform. Define efficiency in this context. So straight away, the question says to define. So you know that you have to define something. It doesn't necessarily tell you to give an example of something that could impact efficiency or something that could increase efficiency, or even an example of a microeconomic reform. But it is a good idea on these exams to have one of those, have an example of all the policy types in the bank. So that way, because if you were to say, you know, something that could increase efficiency, a microeconomic reform that could increase efficiency is defined as this. One example could be subsidizing labor costs or whatever, you know, something like that, something to add a contextual and something concrete to your response, even though the question doesn't tell you to do that. Of course, all of this, though, means that during your exam, you've also gone through the process of weighing up how much time you have, how much space you have to write, how many marks the question is worth, assuming that your exam tells you how many marks each question is worth. So because it is unreasonable to try to do everything for every single question. If a question's only worth 3 marks, you know that there are probably only 3 things that you have to do. So you shouldn't be writing a page to answer 3 marks worth, and especially going over the space to write and things like that. All right. Here's one from the public 2021 QCE external exam. This is an extended response question. I haven't included the stimulus, but looking at the question 13 here, we would get the gist of it. And it's a good context for the approaches I recommend that students take. So here we have the problem, Australia's aging population, and we'll assume that the stimulus had data on Australia's aging population. And then it asks to evaluate which policy would be more effective in addressing the aging population, one that targets incentives to save for retirement, and one that targets labor supply. We would also assume that somewhere in the stimulus would be a little bit of detail as to what the incentives for saving for retirement are. Is that just a government? Is that like a bonus contribution from the government? Is that increasing interest rates? Something like that. And the same, what type of policy? The purpose here, though, is to identify that a lot of students would think, oh, I'll just write about one of them as being the one that is stronger. Maybe one is stronger. Maybe the stimulus points to that. So therefore, I will only write about the stronger policy, take a few jabs at the other policy for being less effective, but then leave it at that. Where oftentimes the markers will want to see that they're both reasonable policies, and therefore there are positives and negatives. There might even be equal positives and negatives, and therefore either policy might be appropriate for a top level response. It's just in the justification, the perspective you take, or which of the problems you feel is the most important or the most significant. But running through the cost benefit analysis or the method of problem solving, the pros and cons of both policies, to leave time to say the positives of option 1, the negatives of option 1, the positives of option 2, the negatives of option 2. However, or in the end, in conclusion, option 1 is better because it does have this, and this, but not these problems, and that's more significant. So that's the approach, like to that type of question. Here was another one from this is the 2020 QCE one, and this is a really good example of the tricky trend. Can you spot the tricky trend? This is one of the automatics here, because these 3 sets of stimulus on the surface look pretty straightforward, especially this last one down here, current cash rate 3.5. There isn't very many ways to interpret that. And then we have new vehicle sales increasing and then down, and then we have business confidence and we have consumer confidence as well. The question was generally along the lines of what would the impact be on a 75 basis point cash rate decrease? from the current cash rate of 3.5. So if the current cash rate was 3.5 and they decided to decrease it to 2.75, how would that impact the economy given these two data sets, right? And this is a very long in the tooth or substantial question. It's worth 9. It's definitely a paragraph or two to answer it. There's a couple of stimulus, a lot of numbers there. It's a complex question. There's, you have to know about monetary policy and consumer confidence, business confidence. Think of a way to explain what the relevance of new car sales and such. But I put this here for an example of the tricky trend. And I'm curious if any of you are watching and listening, and are you seeing that, say with this one, that consumer confidence, there's ups and downs, but by far consumer confidence as a whole kind of decreased pretty significantly from year 1 to year 5. There are some upswings. There's a big downswing here, but then it did pick up. But generally, you could draw a straight trend line from where's my mouse go? From there down to there, right? Can you see that business confidence doesn't follow that same trend? Because on the surface, it does. It looks like business confidence is mostly decreasing, but after year 3, business confidence turns upwards pretty markedly, right to the point where, I don't have a ruler on me, but it almost looks like business confidence came pretty close to rebounding back to its original year 1 level. So you wouldn't be able to say that business confidence dropped the entire time the way you would consumer confidence. And this is a question where they wanted to see, the markers would want to see that you could see that. So you could say that the economy is slowing down, consumer confidence is slowing down currently, and so maybe the decrease in the cash rate would help increase consumer confidence. But there would be merit in saying, oh, that being said, after year 3, business confidence was going well. So perhaps the economy wasn't as slow as it may seem. Business confidence has been going well for the last 2 years, year 3, year 4, year 5, and just a way to kind of acknowledge that trend. I don't think that transforms the entire response, but just seeing not so fast if you were to say something like both business confidence and consumer confidence dropped. All right, so there's an example of the tricky trend there, right? Another thing I think off the top of my head with this question is that this 1350, it's circled as the peak. So is there a reason why that's circled? Perhaps they just want you to quote the number to be able to say that at year 4, new vehicle say is peaked or something like that. All right. Here is one more extended response question, where there would be a lot of stimulus involved here, where this question here is evaluate the extent to which the Australian government has achieved its economic growth objective over the last 5 years. I do believe that 2020, this is not the 2022 question. I think this is an older one. Apologize for that typo on the slide. Objective over the last 5 years. Did the government achieve economic growth over the last 5 years using two criteria? Using two criteria. So there with the approach, then the goal would be to making sure that you understand which criteria are you going to use. Are you going to use for economic growth? That's the objective, but employment and inflation or cost of living or the performance of the household sector, and where in that, like, it's also as well not a distinct yes or no question, but as well it is a to what extent question. So how much is it very likely? Is it significantly likely? Did they definitely achieve economic growth? Did they no way achieve economic growth? Did they moderately achieve economic growth? Were some things expanding, but other aspects of the economy, there's a lot of nuance there in the approach, and combine. Now this is where where you combine the automatics and the approach to be able to see everything in the stimulus. Obviously, in the purposes of a 20-minute seminar, we can't really unpack this question in full. All right. And I think that was that. Um, oh, I do have a question. Thank you as well, Andy. Would it be better to structure it like positives of one, positives of two, negatives of one, negative of two, or positive of one, negative of one, positive of two, negative of two? So do we want to go, are we comparing the positives of either policy and then the negatives of either policy, or just really interrogate the first policy, pros and cons, or really interrogate the policy, um, and then the second policy, pros and cons? I'm only a teacher in Queensland, and so I can only speak to my own experience. But I would imagine that the as long as you're hitting all of those points, I can't imagine. And your arguments are clear and cohesive and convincing and referencing the data. I don't imagine that the order of which you go matters in terms of the marks. So usually, usually for the my advice to students would be you go with the structure that feels the most natural to write, the one that is the easiest to write, as long as you hit all of the positives and all of the negatives, or a balanced number, and both of the policies. I don't think the order sort of matters. In which case, you're thinking more as if it's an essay structure, and that's a different set of marking criteria, as opposed to the economic, especially the final exams there.